Hi, everybody, and welcome to the LGBTQ plus youth leadership panel. This is part of the National Empowerment Center's Youth Leadership webinar series. And today's speakers are Yakas and Zen Q, Zenni Muhammad. And I'm Shira Collings. I'm the youth coordinator at the National Empowerment Center, and I'll be the moderator. And I'm just going to go through a few housekeeping slides before we go ahead and get started with the panel. So first of all, this webinar was developed in part under a grant from the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. The views, opinions, and content expressed in this presentation do not necessarily reflect the views, opinions, or policies of the Center for Mental Health Services, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, or the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. This webinar will be recorded, and the PowerPoint, sorry, that shouldn't say PowerPoint because we're not really going to be using a PowerPoint, but the recording will be posted to our website at power2u.org. And at the end of the webinar, there will be a Q&A session. So you're invited to ask questions at any time. Just put that, you can put that in the chat function. We're not using the question function. Questions will generally be taken in the order that they're received. And you're also welcome to make comments. We want this to be interactive and discussion-based. So feel free to use the chat to introduce yourselves, make comments, give feedback, and ask questions at any point. And so we can have an interactive discussion at the end. So I will now introduce our panelists. Yakas completed her PhD in anthropology and social work at the University of Michigan in 2018 and currently serves as an instructor in the School of Social Work. Her passion is anti-Satanism and disability justice, and she identifies proudly as mad and neurodivergent, queer, polyamorous, and Indigenous Maori. She is committed to healing-centered pedagogy and loves to facilitate transformative courses about oppression and anti-oppression. She also enjoys writing and performing radical music stand-up comedy because making fun of the world is another great way to transform it. And Zen Q, Zenni Muhammad, is a QT, POC, peer support advocate whose passion is working on a team developing a youth mental health support program as an alternative to youth psychiatric hospitalization. Zenni, who also identifies as a psychiatric survivor, aims to change the harm caused by our current mental health systems. They are new to the peer support world, but not new to the social justice world. Since Z was a youth, they have been a community activist and organizer for social justice causes with a strong focus on LGBTQ plus rights and racial justice. Zenni is a creative and multifaceted artist who uses different visual arts mediums and writing forms to express themselves. So could each of you just start by telling us a little bit about your roles and the work you do and why you value LGBTQ plus youth mental health work and aspire to incorporate LGBTQ youth as a focus in your work?
I work in community mental health and advocacy as a peer support advocate, and my role is to support individuals within a peer support framework and build mutual relationship as someone who has also lived mental health experiences. And my main focus of work right now is in a youth program. It's ages 12 to 18, and it is an alternative to psychiatric hospitalization. And most of the youth in the program have been hospitalized or are coming out of a screening from the emergency room. And a handful of youth who are referred into the program actually do identify within the community. And I strive to highlight LGBTQ queer youth mental health work because there is a lot of hatred or stigma, discrimination, and challenges that this specific demographic of youth experience. And not every youth is able to find or has a support network or sense of community or belonging, access to healthcare or resources or services that they need to shape their journey and survive. On top of currently the amount of anti-LGBTQ, specifically anti-transgender legislation happening right now at a state level that is attempting to be pushed to a nationwide level, LGBTQ youth are more at risk for mental health challenges. because of these issues. And queer youth are actually 4 times more likely to try to die by suicide. And I think this is when intersectionality becomes really important framework topic to address, because the reality and research shows that within multiple intersections of the LGBT community, there's more evidence of transgender individuals actually being most at risk to try to die by suicide, and also transgender women, specifically transgender women of color, are the most likely to be murdered for hate crime. And with that, it's the LGBTQ community is often highlighted and sometimes overshadowed when it comes to real challenges and accessibility needs and legislation that's really just necessary for our survival and to be able to have our dignity as human beings. And I remember what it was like when I first came out and was questioning my identity and how I was going to fit in the world, on top of experiencing racism and navigating many systemic oppressions. And I struggled in my own mental health and navigating emotions that I did not know how I was going to come out of. And thinking about the youth that are currently coming into our places of work, or that we know, these youth have potentially missed out on milestones of their life due to the pandemic. And youth have had a drastic shift in key brain developmental years and have had to push through social isolation by resorting to screens and media. And there was an influx of youth ER crises over the course of the pandemic, and it's still continuing. And that was the main driver for the agency really starting up this program. And so my team, our goal is to make sure that youth have enough support and feel secure enough to be themselves and go back into their daily routines and be integrated again. And my goal is to be someone in their life that they can trust and look to for support and advocate if they need, and center their voice and make them feel safe and like they're able to be their authentic self.
Thank you so much, Zenni. I'm just so amazed to hear about your work and so happy that you're doing the work you're doing. I just want to share a little bit that I have experience of different mental health challenges and crises as a queer person. And often growing up when I was in crisis or trying to seek help, no one ever asked me like what was going on that was leading me to feel like I wanted to harm myself or like I was having suicidal thoughts. It was just like, you have this diagnosis and you need this medication. And no one ever asked about like, was I experiencing any kind of queer antagonism, transphobia, biphobia, acephobia, things like that, that might be contributing. And so I always just felt like something was wrong with me. I was just broken. And so I'm just really happy to hear that you are creating that space for youth to actually have someone who's going to look at the role those things might be playing in their mental health and just give them space to explore their identity. And I think that's just so crucial to having mental health systems that are actually equitable and affirming.
Yeah.
Laura, do you want to share a little bit about your work?
Thank you. Thank you both. Beautiful. I'm feeling quite touched in this moment, which is a nice space to be in as we convene. I'm Laura. I guess I'll just talk through some of my roles and there'll be a bit of a mishmash. So I think first and foremost, I consider myself a mad pride activist or a sort of mad justice proponent, somebody who is relentlessly working against saneism. I'm an anthropologist too. Don't want to assume everyone knows what that is. So anthropology is the study of humans and humanity and all things related to humans and humanity, which also includes billions of years. Well, okay, billions is wrong. Millions of years of evolution. So non-human primates, And my specific area of expertise is, this will sound very nerdy, hierarchical violence in primates. But what that means for us as humans is I study oppression, right? These ways that we develop categories of us versus them, and then along lines of power, we execute violence. So it's kind of been quite a dark journey for me. To get a PhD in anthropology and social work also demands at minimum 8 years of your life. So that is 8 years of reading about violence and talking to people about violence. So there's a lot of, I just want to honor too the sort of vicarious trauma that a lot of us can experience, not even necessarily our own, but just by bearing witness, by choosing a path that exposes us to the world's pain. Incidentally, one of my favorite words in the whole world is not in English. It is a German word, and the word is Weltschmerz, pronounced very badly, but that word means literally world pain. So the pain of your whole species, of your whole planet. Anytime you cry because those polar bears are dying because of us, that's Weltschmerz. You know what I'm saying? And so a lot of that has been a part of my journey and factored into why I'm also a psychiatric survivor. Thank you for using that term. Zenni, you used the term psychiatric survivor. I haven't used that in a while. It was replaced with MAD, the reclaimed term for someone who has been harmed by sanism and pathologizing mental health systems. But I am a psychiatric survivor. I think it's just that it's been a long time since I've experienced that pain, and I'm well now. So it's interesting how that's shifted for me, and I no longer feel the need necessarily, but I am somebody who was deeply controlled, forcibly medicated, forcibly restrained by the mental health system for many years, nigh a decade. Shira also said that I'm a musician and comedian. That's a really important part of the roles that I play in the world. I do a lot of comedy because I do think that speaking truth to power, but with humor on your side, can really heal and liberate. And I've had shows that I literally walked out of thinking, I don't think I'm ever going to experience internalized sanism again, or internalized queerphobia again. That was so healing and so liberating and so affirming. My major hit show is called Slut Songs, slut being a reclaimed term for non-monogamous or polyamorous person. And it's it's next level. Also, I will just say there's a lot of things that are terrifying in this world. Very few things are more terrifying than standing up on stage about to do stand-up comedy. Just if you were ever wondering if that's terrifying, it is. I finished my PhD in 2018, and I've been since then teaching in the School of Social Work at University of Michigan, which is also where I went to school. And I teach primarily the anti-oppression related courses, especially anti-sanism. So how to provide MAD affirming or neurodiversity affirming mental health care, which obviously, as you can imagine, is very complex because social work is not a particularly radical profession in this respect, still relying on the DSM and all of these pathologizing labels and diagnoses that Shira alluded to. Also, I just want to add, I am in fact 35 years old, which is really pushing it as far as youth goes. But I think it's important you know that, because otherwise you're like, how is this 25-year-old got a PhD in 2018 and multiple years of work experience? You need to know 35. So thank you, Shira, for considering me youth, I just have to say. What else was I going to say? I think most of my work at present, I'm starting to shift in this direction now. Up until the last couple of years, I wouldn't have necessarily said my work has a queer focus explicitly. I was much more immersed in MAD studies and in anti-sanism in general, right? Which, of course, you should and always approach everything with intersectionality. But I have started getting more into sexuality, gender, related research in the last couple of years. And this is courtesy of one of my most wonderful colleagues, Dr. Shanna Katz-Katari, who is actually famous enough in the sexuality world that some of you might be like, "Ooh, I know them." And what inspired me to get involved in this stuff is lived experience, very similar to what Zenni said. The fact that I was wounded by this system, I had no choice. It's like crumble and go down the path of internalized sanism, continuing, like believing that there's something wrong with me, believing the world's messaging that I'm not going to be competent. I almost dropped out of grad school because I thought, well, what autistic mad people are in front of me in the classroom? None, right? Like, do I see modeled in front of me any professionals who share this particular identity? And I didn't, which isn't to say they weren't out there. Like, I was grasping at, fangirling different famous mad studies scholars at other institutions, but at Michigan, where I was, there was just no representation. Luckily, I was well supported and made it to the point where I did finish my degree. But so just shout out to all of the mad studies scholars who have been paving that way for me, and without whom I would still believe there was something wrong with me, maybe. That's done. Fini.
Thank you so much. And I also struggled with being mad or having lived experience in grad school and feeling like there was little representation of people in my field or in academia in general, with those identities. So I really appreciate the work you're doing. And I did want to ask, I think not everyone here may be familiar with the terms MAD and the term anti-sanism or sanism. So could you share a little bit more about what those mean to you?
Yes, thank you. So sanism is the term, it's got a, I was like, who first coined this term? There's been a few people, I don't actually know who first made up the word sanism, but I've read it going back as the early 2000s. It's the name, it's a variation of ableism. So if you've heard of ableism, you've heard of sanism. It's just that sanism is more specific to people who are pathologized and excluded and oppressed because of mental health or neurodivergence, because of deviating from norms of sanity and normality that are specific to mind and behavior, rather than ableism, which is much more broad and includes all sorts of physical deviations from normal as well. So because sanism has always existed even before people named it, and the people who named it are people who are in the lineage of mad justice or mad pride. And so mad historically was a derogatory word used to describe people who today we would use the term mentally ill, but that whole concept of mental illness relies on trusting a mental health system that is consistently pathologizing neurodiversity, which means like valid, natural, normal in the not in the sense that we use it in our society, but completely natural, expected variation in the ways that humans think, feel, and behave in this world, right? So when we think of neurodiversity, you might think of ADHD or the autistic community, people who just are configured a little differently from what our society has considered or decided is normal. So we have this term neurodivergent to sort of call attention to the fact that, no, I'm not disordered. There's nothing wrong with me. I merely diverge from what our society calls normal. And so the term mad was also reclaimed, like similar to how the word queer has been reclaimed. The term mad was reclaimed by a variety of activists, I think as early as the 40s. I might be needing correction on this, but the Mad Pride movement has quite a deep history, even if it's a quiet history. There are really amazing activists. Judy Chamberlain in the 60s and 70s wrote an amazing book of like psychiatric survivorship. I think she might have even coined the term sanism, or she might have coined the term mentalism instead, which is basically the same thing, a synonymous term that doesn't get used as much. But yeah, so today the word mad gets used in lieu of mentally ill. So when I say I am mad, what that means is my society has called me mentally ill, but I reject that on the grounds that they are pathologizing my neurodivergence and also logical responses to trauma, right? Almost every diagnostic label in the DSM, if you think and feel and dig into it, we're just looking at neurodivergence. I mean, hearing voices. Why not, right? Why is this not allowed in a species as diverse as ourselves, right? That's just one example. And depression, anxiety, like how are these not logical responses to not just living in an oppressive culture today, but to the mountains of unmetabolized intergenerational trauma we've all inherited from our ancestors, right? So that's what saneism and madness are sort of about. Thank you also for asking for that clarification. It's really important to make sure that folks are all like with us as we continue speaking.
Yeah, thank you so much for clarifying that. So I know we've already touched on intersectionality and the role of different identities, and how that intersects with queerness. And I know, Zenni, you've done a lot of work around the role of race. And I was wondering if you could tell us more about your work around that and why you feel it's crucial to have an anti-racist focus in LGBTQ youth peer work.
Yes. I am someone who kind of consistently works to dismantle white supremacist culture and the idea that whiteness is the norm. And white supremacist culture is something I've been studying for a while and breaking down just within myself and also like with groups of friends or with my family, and like these kinds of things about race that we've internalized. And also breaking away from the fact that like white supremacist culture really just upholds a lot. It intersects with a lot of different things of like, oh, whiteness is the norm, but also being cisgender is the norm, or being straight is the norm, or being binary is the norm, or being sane is the norm. And so I'm kind of always work to do that. And like I briefly got into before, like just the certain biases or prejudices or assumptions that, you know, people can hold about or towards specific groups of people. And I've noticed that in my own experience showing up in a lot of like LGBTQ spaces, there isn't talk about intersectionality specifically with race. And sometimes there's a big disconnect in between us. And I know for certain from growing up in a predominantly white area and in spaces that I haven't always felt accepted in those spaces because there is little to no conversation about how race plays a role or shows up in people's experiences or not, and how pieces of people's identity kind of intersect. And it's something that is not often talked about, right? It's an uncomfortable topic. I mean, all of these are uncomfortable topics, but I feel like, especially growing up in a predominantly white area, because people are surrounded by the idea of whiteness being a norm and race not really coming up as a conversation at all because everyone kind of looks like them. That was hard for me to be the one to initiate. And also with the intersection of my other identities being queer and how that really showed up. And yeah, I just find it how it intersects in so many different parts of my life and how it influences my internalism in different aspects of my identity. So that's my main drive for kind of working through that anti-racist stuff and bring up white supremacist culture, because it is one of the biggest things I feel like that creates a disconnect for me and myself and also within others, and shapes our society in a very interesting way.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. I think it's so important to acknowledge the ways that white supremacy is often at the root of so many different forms of oppression and don't acknowledge that enough in I think lots of different spaces. So it sounds like intersectionality, that's a big influence on both of your work. Laura, I was wondering if you could tell us more about that and maybe any other social theories that have influenced your work.
Yes, thank you. Yes, intersectionality has forever, like ever since I learned the term, which was quite early, like I can't remember when it blew up in academia and social justice circles, but it was long enough ago that is something that has been felt natural to me for a while. And I also just want to take a moment to little bow to Kimberly Crenshaw for coining this term. Something, actually, this is a little tangent, but one of the ways that I like to teach my classes is with because I'm very committed to disability justice, which is also one of an incredibly intersectional social justice movement. And it foregrounds the fact that ableism is rooted in racism, and it is rooted in capitalism, and it is rooted in like cis hetero patriarchy. My favorite term, I think, and I'm trying to remember who coined it. Well, there was Bell Hooks, who with the OG white supremacist capitalist patriarchy. And then I think people expanded on that term. And I think Johanna Hedva as well, who wrote Sick Woman Theory, another amazing ancestor, used the term white supremacist imperial capitalist cis hetero patriarchy to kind of have one term that kind of can comprehensively describe the multiple mechanisms of oppression in our world. And the one term lets us know that these things are all inseparable, right? You cannot discuss white supremacy without discussing ableism, stainism, cis hetero patriarchy, all of the rest, right? Fat phobia, all of our ideas about normal are very limited and have a space or a name in this term. So yeah, I think that was a bit of a tangent. I just like to honor my ancestors. I like to remember who came up with this, whose thoughts were these, or what is the lineage of this thought. So often at the end of my classes, I'll end with like an ancestor acknowledgement. So, ancestor acknowledgement to Kimberly Crenshaw for intersectionality. Some other really meaningful theories that have that shape my thinking and my practice. There's the minority stress theory, which relates a lot to Johanna Hedva's sick woman theory. Like the key thesis of both of these is that oppression is stressful. Stress causes harm to bodies and minds, or body minds, if you want to reject dualism or the idea that the body and mind are separate. There's this term body mind that gets used a lot in disability justice circles. So yeah, oppression is stressful. Stress causes harms to body minds. So therefore, oppression is harmful, or as you know what I'm saying, people who experience more oppression will be experiencing more stress and damage because of that. And it doesn't seem like that revolutionary of an idea, but it is, and it was in its time. We may take for granted today just the fact that, yes, oppression is harmful. Like it hurts people. And it's the kind of violence that also radiates a bit like a bomb, because we may think, like when I grew up, I used to think the people who are targets of systems of oppression, they are the only ones who get hurt, right? Privilege means you don't get hurt at all. And it's been, the more I've grown and the more nuance I've added into this, I've realized, no, actually oppression harms everyone in a society, not equally by any measure. And one person who really helped me think about this is Resmaa Menakem. If you've heard of him, he's a social worker, and he's committed to something called somatic abolition, which means like cleaning our body from oppression, in the physical, like healing the trauma of oppression specifically, right? So how can I heal from the wounds of white supremacy or capitalism? And in his book, he makes it very clear that white people are not exempted from racial trauma. It's just a different racial trauma, and I will definitely say not equal and not as serious or harmful, but there is trauma in whiteness, and there is trauma in cis heteronormativity, right? There is repression, there's always fear, right? Oppression creates a constant culture of fear of, if I mess up, like people are gonna come for me, or the world's gonna come for me. I'm not safe here. And so so I think I've said, where's my Menicum? Oh, Robert Sapolsky, an amazing anthropologist who studies stress-related harm, and he studies stress-related harm in all primates. So when I consider myself somebody who's passionate about primate, social justice, it's not just for humans. Like, I would love to see baboons beat each other up less, if you know anything about baboons, they can be a pretty violent creature. Chimpanzees, woof, they rip each other's faces off. And obviously we're all part of the same cloth there. And then I would also like to say that the folks from MAD studies and neurodiversity studies, those who taught me what saneism meant and helped me see it, because until I could see it, I had no idea it was hurting me, right? And if you can't, Dr. Dan Siegel has this phrase, name it to tame it, that some of you might have heard of. He's a trauma sort of specialist. If you can't kind of identify and name the harm, it's harder to tame it or move through it in a healthy way, right? And so some of those folks in MAD studies and include, wrote down some names, Brenda Lefrancois, can't necessarily know that I'm pronouncing her name right, Bradley Lewis, Richard Ingram, Peter Beresford, and then in neurodiversity studies, there's Devin Price, who just wrote the book Unmasking Autism. It's heavenly. And Nick Walker, who wrote a book recently called Neuroqueer Heresies. So these are some of my ancestors, and some of them are the same age as me, but they're still an ancestor if they've given you something that, like, ancestral knowledge. I use the term ancestor quite loosely to mean somebody who has shaped me in a meaningful way. Yes, I'm done. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate both of your perspectives on intersectionality and the need for LGBTQ activism and spaces and affirming care to be not just about queer identity, but all other types of oppressed identities. So I wanted to ask what you both feel are the biggest challenges facing LGBTQ youth, and how can peer services help to address those challenges?
Yes, that is a big question. I feel like there's a lot of challenges. I mean, peer support as a whole is kind of rooted in justice and also creating a whole other alternative from the typical psychiatric system and model. It's to have someone who has experience directly in what you're going through to be able to talk to you, to connect with you. And it has a whole framework that is set up in creating mutuality and connection and growing together. And it's non-coercive, it's non-prescriptive, and it's really just about showing up for someone else. And so I think as a whole, peer services is really, really beneficial for that, especially with systems that people turn to that often cause harm, or they are trying to navigate or figure out what's the best decision for them to make, or finding providers that are going to cater towards their identity or are supportive or listen to them or show up for them. But I think that biggest challenge, I mean, there's a lot of there's a lot of challenges. I think off the top of my head right now, I think language is becoming a really big challenge, with specifically pronouns, and older generations, and also just the disconnect of that and the lack of respect between that and people just wanting to be respected, and that being a challenge, and the whole worshiping of the written word thing. I know that specifically with youth, I know that gender neutral bathrooms have been a big issue. I know that representation is a really big issue. a lot of youth not feeling like they're able to see healthy representations of themselves in their community, at their school, staff at their school, people who are in leadership roles or higher education or in decent professions, or just seeing other LGBTQ people living their life and there not being any stigma to that or no negativity along with it.
I wrote down some of the things too that you'd said to make sure that I was like, so language, legislature, which you'd mentioned a little while ago, a huge thing, representation. These are all like, because if I was to answer a question like this, I'm a very macro thinker, and that is something that's sometimes actually really difficult because I often forget or don't think of or just am oblivious to the minutiae, the details and the things like that that actually practically in the moment are upsetting to people. Like if I was to ask like a young queer person here in New Zealand, what are your biggest struggles? They might say something like bullying at school, right? Whereas if you were to ask me, what are the biggest problems that hurt queer people, young and old or any age, I'll have a big macro lofty answer like, it's the cis hetero patriarchal foundations that our ancestors have given to us, and so as a macro thinker, that was my first answer. I was like, well, the answer is cis hetero patriarchy, and cis hetero patriarchy is obviously responsible for all of those smaller details: legislature, microaggressions, lack of representation and visibility. I think of oppression and of harm in general as having kind of these two buckets. There's the active presence of direct harm, and then there is the sort of absence of needs being met, right? So when we think of like representation, like who am I seeing? That's sort of like an unmet need. That's an absence. And then when we think of like microaggressions, that's a more direct harm, right? Or hate crimes or things like that. And so there's obviously a lot of the unmet needs and a lot of the direct harms that are all rooted in really cis hetero patriarchy, or if we're going to be more comprehensive, the white supremacist imperial capitalist cis hetero patriarchy. And I know that peer services are, it's one little part of the change, right? So peer support is not trying to necessarily unmake the entirety of cis hetero patriarchy. And to be honest, a lot of my focus when I'm like is on like figuring out how to survive and thrive in the world that we currently have, which includes a little bit of trying to make the world that we want. But I do like I think a little bit more in, well, like how can we make the best of our world while we're here. And so I think there are many ways that we can do that. We can help people survive and even thrive in oppressive conditions. And so I think there's a few ingredients to this. I think one of the most important is critical consciousness combined with healing. So what I was saying earlier, until I knew that saneism was a thing, there was no opportunity for me to begin to cleanse myself of that internally, right? And so you kind of have to simultaneously raise consciousness or raise awareness to teach people new language, teach people new terms. If they have never heard of the term cis hetero patriarchy, like they need to know this term, right? Like a young queer person needs to know this concept, needs to know that there's a rhyme or a reason to the struggle, right? It helps you metabolize and make sense of things when you just can grasp it, can wrap your head around it a little, or at least I find that. I think it's important. And then simultaneously, you are working to heal and compassionately reckon with the fact that this is in you, right? We've all internalized oppression and it really sticks. No matter how much work I do, there are still days where I have a mad experience. Maybe I get a panic response because I've got some trauma. I get an unwanted panic response. And still there are days where my first thought is, damn it, stupid Laura, bad, rather than, oh, here's a panic response for me to compassionately respond to with love and generosity, right? And that's my internalized sanist right there, being like, no, don't go down, don't be mad, don't have a mad experience. And that's just the sanism, right? With cis heteropatriarchy, it's another layer, right? There are days where like I might have an attraction to someone, and then, oh no, don't have that attraction. That's a naughty attraction. You're not meant to be attracted to her or him or them or whatever the scenario is. So I really think peer support can help people liberate from that internalized oppression, because it's a space to name what's going on, the shared experience. You can see that representation that Zenni was saying, right? And I think sometimes just having people feel belonging goes a long way. Even in like the worst world that you can imagine, like a group of people who feel love for one another and feel affinity and belonging can spiritually or in their hearts and souls still have a place to rest that is safe, right? Oh my God, sorry, I started to well up a little. That's so embarrassing. Not embarrassing. It is an invited emotional response. There we go. But I just cannot say enough that belonging and purpose, feeling like not only do you belong, but you have a role in whatever magic you're making with your community. And so, yeah, I kind of think of liberation as a combination of consciousness raising, healing, and then activism, right? And activism very loosely defined, whatever you do to try and make the world a better place, whether it's having a difficult conversation with a healthcare provider, insisting that your pronouns be respected, being like, sorry, but you've said she a couple of times in this session, and I'm going to have to insist that it's, whatever it is that you do, these small moments that shift the world. And yeah, with those sort of things and feeling belonging and purpose, it can make the world survivable. Not that I don't think it's very important that we continue to try and change things. Like, we should be fighting that transphobic legislature with every sort of, tool in our arsenal that we have. But if all you ever do is just learn to love yourself and those around you and to speak that truth whenever it's appropriate, if that's what you do in this world, that is so more than enough. That is so beautiful, right? You don't have to be marching on like Capitol Hill. You don't, obviously some people do, but not all of us are cut out for every kind of social change role. I think I got a little bit off the rails there, but I think I answered the question.
Definitely. Thank you so much for that answer. I think it's so important to have both the like systems level change and that micro level change or support or just ability to feel safe. Zenni, I was wondering if you had anything else you wanted to add to that, to build off that, or if you'd like to move on to the next question.
No, I'm just kind of processing. So I might be best for me to go to the next question. So, yeah.
Okay, great. So why do you think it's important for LGBTQ youth to have leadership roles in mental health services and research?
Because LGBTQ queer people exist and can experience marginalization and are in a high-risk category of these things in mental health. And also it is kind of tying back into what you were saying, Laura, like we are the ones living the experience and are the experts of it. So they should be in leadership roles, creating these, whatever it is, the legislation, the laws, the policies, the agreements, whatever it is. And specifically with research, I feel like it's important for it to not just be about the negative aspects of a queer experience, like about lifespans or suicide rates, but to also just be about our general lives and to show more statistics or things about that are actually really important and representative about how many non-binary youth and adults actually exist in the world, and to let people know that they're not alone in these experiences, and that there can be a sense of belonging and that you can exist. And yeah, that's such a big question. I might tie back to that. I'll let you go, Laura.
Yeah, we can maybe just build on each other in this, because I was really just, when you said that research really needs to be more comprehensive and not just focus on the problems, but also the pride, the community, because universities, right, who are producing this research, or whatever, they talk a big talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, right, a lot of times. But the talk is not necessarily matched, and to be talking about a cultural group who has existed in many ways, shapes, or forms since forever. Let me also say, as an anthropologist who knows about our whole history, not just who we are today, but the millions of years that we came from, we have always been queer, period. And not just all humans, mammals, like sexual reproduction has from the get-go been queer. Read the book Queer Ducks and Other Animals if you don't believe me. There are the only reason why heteronormativity exists is because humans invented it. The idea that heterosexual was normal and something to depart from, absolutely ludicrous. If it was alien scientists from another planet that came to sort of map out human and mammal sexuality, they'd be like, okay, so this is a queer planet. Cool, great, got it, done. But no, our ancestors who were homophobic and transphobic and all the rest lied, made mistakes, betrayed some of the fundamental laws of biology, which I won't get into because it's a little, but I'm just saying we are, as a species, and have always been queer of all kinds, right? Gender diversity, sexual diversity, all of it has always been here. And so yeah, and I loved what you said too about the centering of pride in the narratives. And I also it made me think that I should have said earlier, the Mad Pride movement that I was speaking about earlier, it could not have existed without the gay and queer pride movements that predated it, right? This notion of pride in an oppressed or pathologized identity does actually, at least in my knowledge, like the sort of began, or like one of the earlier groups was the queer, gay, trans sort of community. So I guess the Mad Pride movement honors that ancestry there. But yeah, I do think research that takes that broader perspective is really, really, really important. And what you had said about representation and visibility. If there were trans people in whatever the states policy makers who were trying to pass these transphobic bills, we might be having a different conversation, right? And so I just think it's a complex thing, but it really is important for queer folks, and not just queer folks, but all of the intersectional ways that people can be hurt in this world. But yeah, I think I'm also a bit like stumped. Maybe I would just add, I think it's really important as well to not just center queer voices, but kind of start decentering non-queer voices. Like if you're not queer and you're writing about queer or LGBTQ plus issues, like I think you need to sit down. Like the microphone needs to have a little moment where it blacks out. Someone needs to pull the plug, or metaphorically, the old ways that they used to get people off the stage who had been on too long, and they'd be like, somebody get the hook. They'd get this big hook and just swipe them off the stage. Somebody get the hook, right? That's how I feel. And I feel the same way about other, like white people writing about racism. Great, it's helpful, it's good. White people do your work. But you also, the hook, non-mad people writing about mental illness, or somebody get the hook. Non-autistic people talking about autism, hook, not to say that the hook then puts you in like out of the world, but you just need to like get off the stage for a moment. I'm personally done listening.
Zenni, do you have anything?
As Shira said, this is not necessarily the perspective of the substance abuse member.
Yes,
this is Dr. Laura Yakas.
Definitely part of the disclaimer.
Yeah, I just want to say I appreciate that perspective. I just think for so long, mental health spaces have been dominated by straight, cis, white people without lived experience. And I think even peer spaces, which are so great and are doing so much work to center the voices of people with lived experience, it's still often straight, white people with lived experience. And so I totally hear you, and I completely agree that we need to be centering other voices and maybe decentering some voices that have traditionally been centered, not to say that those experiences aren't valid or that those experiences don't need to be heard, but just that it's time that other voices are heard to make room for that. So
totally. They can come back on the stage for a little cameo later, no problem. Their part's not done. They'll be in the chorus section at the end, but like their solo, it's done.
You cannot be a solo anymore.
No solos. Maybe that's
I like that. Yes. Well, thank you both. So what is your vision for what affirming mental health services and peer services for LGBTQ youth could look like in the future?
That we don't need mental health services that are just affirming but safe. And that are provided by people who are educated and knowledgeable about the audiences they're supporting, specifically with LGBTQ issues and the challenges, and someone to kind of bridge the barrier, fill in the gaps, and be a representative of the youth that need support in alignment with their voices, and be an in-depth listener, and validate and have respect for those you serve. Constantly aim to be more intersectional, accessible, open to critique, change, and just do the work.
I love that you started with the word safe. That kind of just felt really good in my body as you said it. Like, yes, affirming is great, but baseline needs to be just safe mental health care. And then if you throw back to what I was saying earlier about saneism, right? Our current mental health system is fundamentally sanist, right? It is oppressive. And remember, oppression is stressful and stress causes harm. Stress is not safe. So we do not have a safe mental health system. Like, that is period. And I don't know, something about just saying that out loud feels important, right? Our mental health system is, for many people who interface with it, not safe, right? And we have this term, iatrogenic trauma. That's a sort of concept from the medical health sciences world, and iatrogenic means caused by the intervention itself. So trauma that would not have happened had that system not attempted to intervene in the way that it did. So people who experience involuntary hospitalization or other forms of like things that are often experienced as traumatizing, right? We not re-traumatizing people, right? Safety seems to be a baseline that we should be striving for. And so I love you for mentioning that. I teach a class in my school called Mental Health Care Without Saneism. It's usually just one lesson in a bigger class, but I have just proposed to make it its own class, a 5-week-long class. And in fact, Shira will be joining me in that experience. Like, I also just want to say, it's so fun collaborating with you, Shira, about anti-sanist sort of ways that we can make mental health care safe, right? And so when I think of mental health care without saneism, I think of it as having sort of two parts. And I want to credit Nick Walker, the autistic scholar I was mentioning earlier, for sort of articulating this as well. Like, number one, affirming mental health care, safe mental health care, does not pathologize at all, really. Does not pathologize natural neurodivergence, right? We never try and fix or change autistic people to become non-autistic, right? We teach autistic people how to thrive in a sanist culture, right? Which can include many things. I used the term unmasking earlier from from Devon Price's book. Unmasking, if folks aren't familiar with what that means, it's the act of, because a lot of mad and neurodivergent people perform sanity, like they develop these really bitterly difficult ways of performing sanity, right? Like, all right, you say to yourself, no, don't wave your hands like this because people are going to think you're weird. So keep your hands still, right? Like that's a classic, any ways that you repress your authentic way of being because you know that sanism might hurt you. That's called masking, right? Literally putting on, and masking can happen for all identities, right? Queer folks mask, they try to maybe perform cis heteronormativity and it hurts, right? It hurts to hide yourself. So teaching folks that they can be mad and neurodivergent without shame and showing, for a lot of folks, that's not something that we just know how to do, right? I mean, so many things that I require to live my life well, I didn't just know how to do those things, right? Even if something simple like making a cup of tea, I certainly don't know just how to liberate from complex trauma and oppression, right? Like, no, people had to help me and show me, ancestors had to. And so that's what we can do. That's what an affirming mental health person does, is they take that responsibility. Like, I need to enlighten you if you're in the dark, right? If you're sitting there thinking there's something wrong with me and I'm here to be fixed by you, thank you very much. That's what a client says to a practitioner. Like, it's not your responsibility it is your responsibility to challenge that thought, right? Because it's important to validate things that people say, but if the thing that they're saying is internalized oppression, it's also important to check that, right? If people hadn't done that, I might still, like I said, believe that there was something wrong with me and that I needed to fix myself or hide myself or something. So showing folks how to unmask and to do it safely, again, bearing in mind that unmasking can be risky for different folks, right? It's much easier for a straight, white, autistic man to begin unmasking than it is for a queer, trans, like woman of color to begin unmasking, right? Because the violence of standing out as strange in your culture is not evenly spread, right? So that's one part of it, is normalizing and embracing neurodivergence, showing folks how to unmask in their varying ways, and how to just harness their gifts and work with the parts of their experiences that they don't perceive as gifts, right? Like, it's not awesome to have such a reactive nervous system that, like, the dog barking next door makes it impossible for me to function. Like, what can I do also to make that a little easier, right? And then the other side of thing is helping folks heal from and name and learn how to tame their trauma responses, right? Because there's so many ways that we just don't know how to be in uncomfortable states, right? Like, the moment I was saying earlier, the moment I get anxious or sad, sometimes I'm like, no, don't go there. That's scary. The culture will shame you. So the more we can do to show folks that there's no experiences that are wrong, right? If you're having a trauma response, your body's meant to have that trauma response. And yes, there are things we can do to soothe you so you can, in this moment, regulate and then process that trauma a little bit more slowly. But processing that trauma is still part of the game, right? Just throwing it in the back burner is I don't know. So that's what I would say. Affirming mental health care does not pathologize neurodivergence, but accommodates, affirms, and teaches folks how to harness and simultaneously addresses the trauma responses or the sort of the anxieties, the depressions, the compulsions, the self-harming, these things that are all just different flavors of stress response, right? Like, and helping folks, learn how to navigate those a little bit more peaceably.
Absolutely. Thank you. I really appreciate the emphasis on both, like, neurodiversity or mad affirming and healing from oppression, because I think it's important to recognize that if mental health care or peer services are LGBTQ affirming, they can't just be affirming of being LGBTQ. Like, you can't affirm one identity and say, okay, I'm affirming of you. You have to be affirming of all the identities that someone might have and all the types of oppression they may have experienced. It's not really safe if someone is only safe to be like one part of themselves. So thank you both for that. So what advice do both of you have for other LGBTQ youth peer leaders or aspiring leaders?
Yeah, I'm just kind of thinking about everything you just said too, because that makes me think of like working to deconstruct internalized things, which I did a lot of first getting into activism sort of spaces, kind of like what we were talking about of like this, just because you may experience oppression doesn't mean you're excluded from oppressing others, or just because you have a privilege doesn't mean that you're excluded from other forms of privilege. You are the own expert of your own story and identity. They say things get better. I never believed that ever in my entire life, ever believe that things get better. But I think things do change in different ways when you don't expect them, and you are able to handle things in different ways, and miracles happen. I don't think things get better, but I think that all of those things. Yeah, I'm still processing the question, but you can go for that.
Thank you. I love that you said that too. It's not that things will get better, but that things will change, right? I think definitely having a fully formed frontal lobe really helps. So definitely for young youth, right? You all don't have a fully formed frontal lobe yet, front part of your brain that really, without it, emotional regulation is always going to be a bit of a challenge, right? Like complex thinking about nuanced things. And besides also trauma and stress limits our ability to have nuanced sort of views on the world. Like the world is a terrible, and there's lots of wonderful, beautiful things that have happened in this world, right? That nuance is not always available to us. So I would echo that, like things will change and your frontal lobe will fully form at some point. If you're, 18, 19, 20, all those age groups, someday your literal brain is going to change. And I guess for me, that was a profoundly welcomed experience. I'm 35, as I said earlier, and the last 5 years of frontal lobe having existence, or fully formed frontal lobe having existence, has been a lot easier than any of the years before. What else? What other advice? So I'm not that good at advice giving, because in general, I think it's so specific. And also I would just say, if anyone is like, oh, I want to know Laura's opinion on this life, like I need this specific advice from Laura, you're always welcome to email me. I'm not very famous and I'm not very busy, and I will have time to respond to your email. That was a bit of a joke about the not very famous. I'm not famous at all. But anyway, I'm not so busy that I can't respond to your emails. If you're like, oh, I want to know her advice on this specific thing, yes. But as far as general advice, I often struggle, because I feel like I've lived such a uniquely both oppressed and privileged life that is not easy to advise someone how to navigate a circumstance that's likely to be very different from mine. Because I've had moments of my past that were just profoundly lucky. I have no idea how I managed necessarily to navigate the systems and structures the ways that I did. So it's hard to advise, but I would say compassion, self-compassion, right? First and foremost, the world is a mess. We are all made messes within it. So compassion, trusting that you are and have always been doing your best, and probably so has everyone else, but even if it doesn't look like it. So yeah, like whatever you're going through and experiencing, like just a little bit of kindness, a little pause between that self-judgment to say, actually, maybe this is okay. Maybe this intense response or this anger, maybe it's okay, actually, is something. Yeah, compassion. Zenni, back to you.
I'm not the best at advice either, to be honest. Trust your gut. That people would tell me that, and I never took it seriously until recently. And that is really true. I think the gut is always right.
Love that. Listen to your body,
Mm-hmm.
Try to both listen to your body and find the parts that are speaking within you that aren't you. That's the deconstructing of internalized oppression, because your gut is always right, as you said, I guess, but except when your gut is actually not your gut, but like the internalized patriarchy speaking within you, right? Like, well, maybe that's not in the gut, but you know what I'm saying? Like sometimes what we feel is or think isn't actually us. And I think of this in terms of it's a therapeutic modality called the internal family systems model. And basically it's this idea that we are not one self that is just coherent and complete. We are a mixture of a lot of different parts, right? Like there's the part of me that's always compassionate, and then there's the part of me that's actually a very vengeful. I have some vengeful violence in me, and there's many. That's just one couple of examples, right? And so there's the patriarchy that's inside me, right? Like, and so learning to distinguish between whose voice is actually speaking at a given time in you, right? Like whether it's like I don't feel safe, who's speaking. What are they responding to, and how can, I don't know, I'm just riffing and building on what Zenni shared there. But I do think it's important to learn to distinguish between the different voices inside you. I often do this with a lot of comedy because I'm a comedian, and laughing and making fun of the world has been part of my identity since I was the smallest of children. Of course, I got in trouble in school a lot for all of the inappropriate humor because I was never good at masking. I've never been much of a masker. It's always been like either the world is going to accept Laura Joy, Jamie Connor Yakas, or that it's not, but she's not going to make herself acceptable to this world successfully anytime soon. And so, comedy really helps. So one thing is I'll be like, hang on, is this me? Or is this the patriarchy just being a hole inside me right now? Like even if it's a silly way of framing it like that, that can help you learn to separate those voices and undo those layers or peel back those layers as you do your healing journeys.
Thank you both so much. That's great advice.
And ask Shira for advice too, because Shira is great at advice giving. That's why I literally invite Shira to my classes, because I'm like, I don't know how to give them like practice advice on this topic. It's a class on social media where it's like, how do you, I'm like, I don't know, because I am not very careful. I need someone who is careful and thoughtful to come in and be like, this is how you do these things. And this is what I would suggest here. So Shira is great at advice, and I'm so grateful to you for that.
Thank you so much. I just have one last question, and I do want to leave some time for Q&A in case we do have people who want to be part of the discussion too. So if you just want to kind of keep your answers a little bit more brief to this one, what would you like those who work with LGBTQ youth to know?
I think the most important thing, and we talked about it earlier, is like listen to folks. I mean, if you are working with queer youth, right, and you are not yourself a queer person, a queer young person, or person who was once young and is queer, making sure that you're listening to those who are, right, like we've said multiple times. And I can actually plug someone specific, because this is not really my area of expertise. I do a lot of writing about mad affirming practice, but queer affirming practice as well as an additional layer, I haven't written as much about. But I'd mentioned earlier my colleague Shanna Katari, their partner / spouse Leo Katari, and they're both very mad queer folks who are steeped in queer affirming best practices for all these things. Their research is very impressive. And they've got a book coming out soon, Exploring Sexuality and Disability, which will include madness, which is a guide for academics and health and human service professionals. I could put that in the chat, the title of this book, maybe, if that would work. I'll just put the title in the thing. So just read the things that you need to read to do your job well. That's what I would say. And that's just one of their books. They've got multiple. They teach a class on queer affirming practice at the university that I teach mad affirming practice in.
Listening is a big one. Also, asking questions, but not asking questions because you just don't know anything, being very strategic about the questions you are asking and how you're asking them, and being intentional about question asking. Yeah, because I feel like working with LGBTQ youth, queer youth, sometimes you never know unless you ask. It's very true. But also coming from a place of curiosity, but not I'm just so curious that I'm taking up way too much space and everything is out of curiosity in a sense. But more so, if you really don't know something, that's going to be a bridge to more connection with that youth than asking a question. I'm very happy about this panel.
Thank
Yes.
you so much. And yeah, I just want to echo that about curiosity. I think a huge part of LGBTQ activism is this idea of like not making assumptions. You can't know somebody's gender or sexual orientation or really anything else about them by looking at them, or by a brief conversation. You really do need to be curious and be willing to let someone share that with you if they feel comfortable with that. And that's why, you know, something as simple as asking someone their pronouns rather than assuming their gender is so important. Like we don't know what identity someone might have, and to assume that feels so against peer values, which is about letting someone be the expert of their experience. And I think being open to not knowing what identity someone might hold until they share that is part of peer values. So just really appreciating that. And we do have about 15 minutes. So I want to open it up for questions. Feel free to put any questions or comments in the chat. We do have one comment that I thought I'd just share in case either of you want to respond to that. Says, I am 61 years old and my frontal lobe is not as good as it used to be when I was young. Just saying.
I just thank you. Honestly, I read that too, and I was like, thank you for adding that and for just adding some more nuance, because that is your truth, and I'm sure a truth shared by others who experience changes to the ways their brains are and work across the lifespan. So yeah, absolutely. Just thank you for adding that extra nuance in there. I loved that.
I wanted to ask, both of you talked about how important it is for LGBTQ youth to have a sense of belonging. How do each of you foster that in your work?
For me, you mean foster it for myself or facilitate it for others, or both?
Both.
I think, well, in my classes, I have a very loving approach. And so I like the experience of like belonging to a class or academic belonging, right? Because I'm in social work, which is not like ruthlessly academic. It's a profession as well, but to create that sense of belonging to a profession, or to belonging to, you know, that a social worker can look like in lots of things, right? Like just making people feel belonging in my teaching is really an important part of my practice. I think my experiences of belonging have come through activism and art, like getting involved in Mad Pride, reading, writing, meeting people. I reached out to Shira by email years ago because I watched a video that they'd made, and now we're friends and we talk all the time and do cool collaborations, you know, just finding community through these shared interests and passions, and as my main ways.
Belonging for me looks very interesting. I feel art is definitely a big one. I feel like just connecting with the earth and diving in to that, and also spiritual sort of things. And yeah, I guess with youth too. What the question was, what was it specifically?
How do you foster a sense of belonging for yourself or for others, or both?
I honestly feel like by showing up authentically for the youth is a big one. Kind of just letting them know that it is okay, that they can open up to me, and them seeing me, you know, having my own sort of stuff going on with like my mental health, and like me telling my stories or whatever it is, and them feeling kind of open enough to talk to me. So, yeah.
We do have a question in the chat. what are the best books on this subject from someone who wants to learn more?
I was just sort of like, I'd seen that too, and I was just thinking about that. So I'm going to there's a link that I'm adding into the chat now. This is another book. So there's the book Exploring Sexuality and Disability that is just above your comment, Jeremy. I'm actually in that book, 2 chapters of it, and it's not quite released. It's like in its last copy edit phase, but it's going to be really good. This other book that I've just linked there is specifically, it's also by Shanna Katari. I'm not in this one. And it's specific to social work and healthcare practice with trans and non-binary folks. But also just if you within to go to Shanna Katari's sort of like page of their finding their, because I think they've written a lot more things like that. There's also the book Unmasking Autism that I'd mentioned earlier, and Neuroqueer Heresies. These both explain saneism in really, really coherent ways. Both of these books are kind of filtered through the autistic experience specifically, but what they have to say about these big picture things and some of the transformations we need in society apply to other forms of madness and neurodivergence as well. And then you're also welcome to email me if you want to be sort of, I can send you my syllabus for the class on mental health care without saneism that I'm teaching soon that I haven't yet finished. But if you email me, I can put my email in the chat as well, even though you probably saw it earlier. I'm happy to share that reading list once it's sort of compiled and organized. But yeah, happy to have that question.
Yeah, I would recommend one that I really like is by Eli Clare, Brilliant Imperfections. And that book it's a memoir, but it talks a lot about how acceptance of disability and queerness and fatness, like they're all related, and it's not really like separate issues.
Yeah, I added that into the chat too, just to. I recently learned Eli Clare was one of the founding members of the disability justice movement too. I didn't know that. That's pretty cool. Like one of these movements that I'm really involved in.
Do either of you have any just like final wrap up thoughts that you want to share?
I'm just grateful to have been here. Thank you all. Just thank you for your attention. Thank you for whatever experiences or thoughts you had, anything you felt or thought during this talk was valid, even if you were like, oh, what is she on about, so just to say thank you for your attention and to validate any and all experiences you had during this time.
Yeah, I also want to say thank you. I'm just grateful I was invited on, and this is a really good conversation, and yeah, it was awesome.
Yeah, I just want to thank you both so much for being here and for all you shared and your willingness to talk about not just your professional experiences and perspectives, but your personal experience. Really appreciate that. And thank you everyone who came today. And thank you, Judine, for doing some of the tech stuff behind the scenes. And yes, I just saw a question in the chat. The recording will be available on the website. We'll also be emailing out the recording and the certificate of attendance to everyone. We're getting a lot of positive feedback for both of you. So thank you again. And I hope you all have a great rest of your day. Bye, everybody.